Hi, everyone. I want to thank the Santa Barbara Historical Museum for hosting this wonderful lecture, along with the South Coast Road Museum and the Goleta Valley Historical Society. I'm very excited to be here with all of you today and share my love and passion for railroad depots and railroad architecture. We've got a lot of history to cover, almost 104 years, so let's dive right in. So the Southern Pacific Railroad, built starting toward Santa Barbara in 1886 and 1887. One of the things I like about Santa Barbara is that it's so diverse in the amount of different depot types that were built by the Southern Pacific Railroad in a geographic area such as our beautiful community. You can see some of these depots up here on the screen. And we're going to take a look at all of these in the South County of Santa Barbara. A little word about myself and my background on depot research. I have been researching depots since 1985. I grew up in a small railroad town called Indio, California, down near Palm Springs. We had a beautiful two-story railroad depot that burned down, unfortunately, before I was born. But it gave me a passion and interest to learn more about the railroad history of my community, which led me to researching and discovering other depots in other communities. Since that time, it's given me a career in architecture for the past 20 years. And again, I am a listed architectural historian with the City and County of Santa Barbara. And I was very honored when in 2017, I was the national winner of the Leicester B Holland Prize from the National Park Service and Library of Congress for a blueprint of all things, a barn instead of a depot. But it was quite an honor, and I am very humbled by that. But let's take a look at what depots we could find here in Santa Barbara County. There's quite a few of them. To begin, railroad architecture is kind of like, it's standardized architecture. Railroads were in the business to make money. So to build buildings rapidly, they developed common standards. The Southern Pacific in particular had 26 standard designs, but they had thousands of other depots that they built to non-standards. But we're very fortunate in Santa Barbara County that we actually had a couple of standard design depots. This is the drafting department in Sacramento in around 1900. A lot of these early depots that we're going to be looking at this evening were designed under the supervision of Arthur Brown Sr. He was the superintendent of bridges and buildings for the Southern Pacific Railroad. And when we talk about railroad architecture and standard plans, again, standard plans allowed for quick and inexpensive buildings. A typical two-story depot would cost about $5,000 or about $140,000 today plus labor. They would choose a particular plan based on the community's anticipated freight traffic and passenger volume. The railroad milled all of its own doors, windows, all of the siding. They were all milled in their Oakland shops and West Oakland shops, and they would be shipped in box cars and on flat cars to be assembled on site, accompanied with a set of building plans, and then also usually lumber carpenters and masons from the railroad. The world of the depots, a lot of times when we see these photographs, they're all black and white, but it really was a very colorful world for these depots. These are just a few of the standard color chips that the Southern Pacific would use to paint their depots. They had standards going back as early as the 1870s. And then here's some paint chips from the 1890s up through 1944. And as you can see, again, most of the photos that we'll see tonight are black and white, but in your mind, keep in mind that these depots were beautiful yellow with brown trim, white doors and windows. and very much colored, and just beautiful buildings. Our first stop this evening is in the town of Carpinteria. The railroad reached here on July 1st, 1887, and the first depot common standard built in Santa Barbara County was this one in Carpinteria in 1887. This was a two-story number 17 depot. It's a right-hand version of the depot. So when you stand facing a depot, you look to see where the waiting room is and the office. If it's when you're standing trackside and you look and it's to the right-hand side, that's a right-hand depot. These depots could be either built right-handed or left-handed. So they were very versatile in their design. The second story was for the agent and his family. The railroad preferred to have agents with families because they were more dependable. They were less likely to get into trouble, and they could be available for the public 24 hours a day. If it was an area that had a lot of available housing, the railroad might build a one-story depot where the agent wasn't necessarily needed to be on the premises 24 hours a day. The Carpinteria Depot had an extended freight house, as you can see here, and an open freight shed. This was very common in a lot of these agricultural areas where the railroads would extend the freight house, and of course, owing to the nice Southern California weather, they could store freight out in the open in these covered sheds. The Carpinteria Depot, unfortunately, did not survive into the modern day. It was closed in September of 1958 and was demolished by March 1967. But if you're fortunate to be in the area, you can go to the Carpinteria Museum and you can see a couple vestiges of this railroad depot, including the original station sign from the depot. This is a blueprint of the depot that I drew. As you can see, the first story consists of a waiting room, office, baggage room, a storage room, and then a large freight house. And then when you look at the second floor, you see bedrooms, living room, kitchen, pantry, etc. When these buildings were first built, they didn't have indoor plumbing. So if you had need of a restroom, you could use one of the common standard outhouses, which would be built usually far away from the depot, usually towards the freight house. They did sometimes have well water, so they would have a little kitchen with a little sink. In later years, a lot of the agents would request that a bathroom be added, especially if community water services were available. So you could actually have indoor plumbing like flush toilets and things like that. But initially, again, as these depots were built in the early 1880s, they did not have indoor plumbing. This is also a look not only at just the depots that the Southern Pacific built, but also some of the unique structures that they built in our area. This is a scale house and a maintenance shed that was built in Carpinteria, showing it in the 1960s and in 2019. Little maintenance buildings like this sometimes survived because they would be purchased by people in the community and used as maybe like a garden shed or a garage. In this case, the city of Carpinteria purchased the little maintenance building down below, and I believe they're using it for their community garden. Another little unknown station that's relatively unknown is the station of Serena. This was just beyond Carpinteria. And here's a wonderful early 1905 map that shows the old wharf that was at Serena and also the train station. Here's a little aerial view to give you a perspective. It was just south of the Polo Club. And you can see a period engraving of the wharf that was there at Serena. I am, however, really excited by this next photo that was provided to me by my friend Hattie Beresford of the Serena shelter. Passenger shelters like this were very common along the Southern Pacific lines. This was an 8-post standard shelter. Those are actually columns supporting the roof. There was a wood platform, and it's a little hard to make out, but there was a little passenger waiting bench. So in instances where you didn't need a full depot to accommodate the passengers, you could have little shelters like this. And we will see several examples of these shelters as we journey forth. I don't have a close-up of the Serena shelter, so the Haynes Depot, which was built on the Santa Paula line, will stand in for Serena. Here's a nice close-up view. You can see those nice Doric columns holding up the, Tuscan columns holding up the roof of the shelter and the little waiting bench. But this is what the Serena Depot or shelter would have looked like. And here's the common standard plan from the actual Southern Pacific for the construction of this particular standard passenger shelter, in this case, a standard passenger shelter number 1. There were many different types that the Southern Pacific had built. Next, we're going to go into Summerland. So let's hop over the hill between 1891 to 2014. Initially, Summerland had a 10-post shelter, but by 1896, they actually got themselves a standard combination 1-story number 11 depot. This was one of Southern Pacific's most inexpensive depots to build. It didn't have a lot of doors and windows. It was rather small in size. It basically depended on how much freight a particular community was anticipated to generate that determined the size of their station. You can see that the depot itself has just been completed, but they haven't pushed the dirt all the way around the loading platforms just yet. This wonderful photo was provided by my good friend, John Woodward. I remember how I mentioned these depots did not have indoor plumbing. If you look down there in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a very common standard Southern Pacific feature, a 2-hole outhouse. These were very common, again, at these stations, and there was a space for men and a space for women. So this is for the public and also for the agent. Here's another view of the Summerland Depot, a little end view. And the depot showing it around 1912. The depot lasted until 1924, and then it was demolished soon afterwards. Now there's an interesting book that talks about how the depot was relocated in Summerland. And I will show you what building that actually was. It wasn't the depot itself. But first, let's look at the blueprint. Again, very simple. Small waiting room, small office, a little storage room, and then a little small freight room. And again, very few doors and windows. So this was very inexpensive to build. The agent would have come to the depot to open it up when trains were coming in. And then when he was done for the day, he would close up the depot and then return to his residence. The building that we're going to look at next is a section house that was built in Summerland in 1897. Section houses were built for the railroad workers that maintained the different sections of the railroads. They typically would maintain a section of about 10 miles each direction, east or west of where the station was. So as you can see from the floor plan, they had upstairs bedrooms, and then downstairs there was a living room, an additional bedroom, and a kitchen. So this way they could have their workers in remote areas, and they could work on and maintain sections of the track and provide living quarters for their agents, for their workers. So here's a picture of the section house that was built in Summerland. You can see Ortega Hill in the background. Here's a little close-up of it to give you an idea of what it looked like. That's a cab forward locomotive for those that are interested in that. So this particular section house was actually moved up to Banner Avenue in the 1950s. It was relocated when the freeway was being built and they were realigning the tracks. So it became a private residence. And I had read about this and said, oh my gosh, I've got to go up there and take pictures of it. So in 2009, I did just that. I found the depot up there, I mean, the section house. Here's a view of the back of it. I was amazed at how much of the original siding was still on this building, and it was pretty much in its original configuration. So it was really neat to see it and compare it to the blueprints that I have of this. Now, sadly, as many of these buildings are, it's no longer with us. It was damaged 2 years later in 2011. When I heard about the fire, I went out there and took pictures of it. And then sadly, the building was damaged beyond repair and it was replaced by a modern residence. So if you're hoping to go out there and see the section house, it's not there anymore. We're going to come to a little unusual depot. Now, this was not built by the Southern Pacific Railroad, but I'm including it in the lecture because it's along the railroad tracks, and a lot of people have, some people have seen this picture of it. This was the little built by a developer. It's called the Hubbard Woods, and it was for a proposed housing development. But I thought it was a really cute, it's not really a depot, it's more of a promotional building, but it's a neat little log cabin. The Southern Pacific did build some log cabin type depots, but again, this was not built by the Southern Pacific Railroad. It wasn't paid for by them, but they obviously had to get permission to build this depot. So, you know, near the tracks. So as we go up Ortega Hill, we're jumping in time, just kind of showing you how things have changed from the 1870s to, you know, the 2014, but its coastline is pretty much almost the same. And as we come down the hill, we get into Miramar, Montecito, and Country Club. So one of the great railroad historians, David Myrick, who I had the pleasure of knowing, has a wonderful book on the history of Santa Barbara and Montecito. I highly recommend them if you're interested in local history. And he does have sections about the railroad history through there. What I did was I took this map from his book and I colored the railroad line as it passes through Miramar and Montecito. So you could see where the original lines were of the 1887 alignment of the tracks and where some of these early passenger shelters and depot was located in Montecito. The dashed curved lines are the original 1887 alignment, and the solid red line is the realignment in 1901. So let's take a look at our first stop on the Dalton Ranch. Oh, I'm sorry, not Dalton Ranch, it's the Miramar. This was the shelter that was built for people to flag down the trains. They started flagging them down in 1892, and by 1897, the Southern Pacific built a little standard 10-post shelter there. And by 1940, they had actually removed the shelter. I love these early images of the Miramar. They're just really pretty. There's so many of them out there, but it's a really nice little shelter. If you're actually wanting to see what this particular type of shelter looked like, you're in luck. There's one surviving 10-post shelter exactly like this in College Park, California. It's up near San Jose. So if you're in the San Jose area, I highly encourage you to venture to College Park and go see this surviving 10-post shelter. Now, there is a replica of the shelter that's in Centerville, California. Again, it's not an original shelter, but it's a replica based on the one in College Park and based loosely on the one here at Miramar. Speaking of replicas, Paul Gausner, who was the owner of the Miramar in later years, actually built a replica. This is not the original shelter. This is a replica in 1984 of the Miramar shelter. The replica lasted until January 2013 when it was removed. So here's a picture of it circa 1990. There is a new depot, if you want to call it that, at the Miramar. This is the Rosewood Miramar. And if you look to the left, there's a little kind of like a re-envisioned depot. Whoops. There's a little close-up of it. It's a little brick building, and it's for the crossing guards that monitor the railroad crossing as it goes through the modern Miramar. A very charming little building, not anything that the Southern Pacific ever built in our area, but it's very charming nonetheless. Here's a blueprint that I drew of the Miramar shelter. I actually traveled up to College Park to measure the surviving shelter there. So that's how I was able to get my drawing so accurate. Next, we're going to look more closely at Montecito between 1887 and 1901. Again, they had a little 10-post shelter and a depot. Here's another wonderful Myrick map that shows the railroad line as it was originally went through in 1887, and then again in 1901. So in 1887, Montecito had a standard number 14 depot. If you look at it would be near the intersection of Channel Drive and if Depot Road went all the way through. So that was built in the spring of 1888. In 1901, the Southern Pacific was straightening their railroad lines. They had more powerful locomotives and they wanted to increase their efficiency. So they were eliminating these really large swoops in their tracks and these large curves. So they were straightening out the route. So in 1901, they put down new track and they didn't need the Montecito Depot anymore, so it was closed. But my friends over at the Montecito History Association had some wonderful family photo albums. This is from the Parrott family album. And this is a young woman that is on her way to Santa Barbara for the day. And the family and staff are there at the depot to see her off. So these are the only known photographs of the Montecito train depot. So that makes them quite rare and quite valuable to depot historians like myself. And so you can never know when you're going to find one of these wonderful depot photos. Just turned out to be it was in a family's photo album. Here's a little look at the Montecito Depot. Again, this was a very small little station, kind of similar to a number 11, one story, minimal doors and windows, but just a very, very small depot, rural depot. Again, Montecito had a 10-post shelter just like they had at Miramar. This particular shelter was the original one that was in Summerland before Summerland got its depot. And so the shelter was moved up to Montecito and reused. That's a very common theme that you'll see on some of our depots throughout this lecture, where depots were routinely and shelters could be moved around on the Southern Pacific system. Here's another great view of the Montecito shelter. There was also one at Country Club that was identical to it. However, I haven't found a picture of it yet. So if there's anyone out there that has a picture of the Country Club passenger shelter, please share it with me. I would love to see that photograph. So now we get into Santa Barbara proper. On August 19th, 1887, the town celebrated. They had a reason to party. They were now joined with the rest of the world by the iron rails. Santa Barbara was unique in that it actually had 5 different depots and stations in during its time under the Southern Pacific Service. This little map kind of shows the original 1887 alignment in blue, and it shows the first depot labeled as number 1, the second depot, which was known as the number 1 depot was known as the Mason Street Depot. Number 2 on the map was the Victoria Street Station. Number 3 was the Gutierrez Depot. It was like a little baggage shelter. And then later years, when the railroad was realigned in 1901, they built the freight house at number 4. And then number 5 is our last Santa Barbara depot, and our current one is the one at downtown Santa Barbara. So here's Santa Barbarans celebrating the first train's arrival to Santa Barbara. And then there's another great photo that I found from the California State Library showing another locomotive that was part of that, those first sets of trains into Santa Barbara. The Mason Street Depot was built in September 1887, so very within a month after the railroad's arrival. Here's a little bit of a more aerial view that you can see. There's Stearns Wharf off in the distance, but the depot is actually close to us, and we'll zoom in here. There's a look at Santa Barbara's one-story number 16 depot. You can see it in the middle bottom of the photograph. And that little whitish square that's on the roof is actually the station sign. You can see some box cars in front of the depot and the kind of like slough area behind it. Here's looking from the mesa back the other direction. There's the depot in the upper mid left section of the photo. You can see a warehouse off to the right and boxcars near it. And a standard number 16 depot, unfortunately, no one ever really photographed our Santa Barbara depot up close. So the King City depot, which was also a one-story number 16 depot, is going to stand in this evening for the Santa Barbara depot. You can see it was a rather large building. It actually had 3 freight house doors on each side of the depot. So there was a lot of freight coming through this station. It was a very long depot. Here's my blueprint of what the Santa Barbara depot would have looked like. And the next depot that was built in Santa Barbara was our beautiful Victoria Street depot. It was actually closer. I always thought this was funny because they call it the Victoria Street depot, but really it was closer to Anapamu and on at the intersection of Rancheria Street. Now, there's only a small section of Rancheria Street that survives today in Santa Barbara. Most of the rest of Rancheria Street, you drive on it almost every day. It's the US 101. So the street was pretty much obliterated when the freeway came through. But here's a nice early Sanborn map that shows the depot actually just after it was vacated by the railroad. But again, standing on the corner of Rancheria and Anapamu. Here's a wonderful close-up of the depot from Ken Kelly's collection. As you can see, this was a beautiful 2-story depot. The upstairs had offices for the railroad, and the downstairs had a separate men's and women's waiting room. In the back of the depot, there was a nice porte-cochere to protect you when you came to the depot. And then on the front there, that's the train order and ticket window. And then you can see the the baggage room off to the left. This depot had a short service life. In 1901, the coast route was completed in March. And so this depot only lasted 5 additional years after that before it was replaced. And the depot was closed in 1906. This is a great photo because it shows the baggage room end of the Victoria Street Depot in Santa Barbara. It's very rare to see a picture like this, and I was pleasantly surprised by Michael Redman when he found this in the collection of the Santa Barbara History Museum. And this was another little gem that he had and shared with me, because I love this. This is a close-up of the ticket window and also the ladies' waiting room. You can see the sign just above the gentleman there in the hat. And I think it's fitting that it says, "Must we part?" because, again, the depot was torn down in 1908. But you can see all these wonderful details in the depot, the arched ticket window, the little brackets underneath there. Really a beautiful depot. There was actually a couple of this type of depot that were built by the Southern Pacific. They were in San Luis Obispo, very much up the road, Salem, Oregon, and a couple of others. Sadly, none of these depot types have survived. There's a small section of the Salem depot that did survive, but it's only the baggage room portion. The most intact depot that we had was the one in Colton, but it was torn down a couple of years ago. Here's my blueprint of the Santa Barbara depot. Again, a beautiful Victorian depot. You know, it's got the fish scale shingles on it, the ornate brick chimney, those beautiful finials and ridge cresting. I mean, this is the height of Victorian ornamentation. So when you look at the floor plan, this is a passenger depot completely because there's no freight room. You can see the men's and women's waiting rooms. Those are the largest rooms in the building. A rather large office in the middle. There was indoor plumbing in this particular instance. And they also had a rather large baggage room, as you can see on the left-hand side of the depot. This is a little bit of a lesser known depot. This was the Chapala Street depot that was located on the corner of Chapala and Gutierrez. Again, this is along Southern Pacific's original 1887 alignment as it came through and down the middle of Gutierrez Street. Let's take a look at it. I was super excited when I found this photo because it is the only known photograph of the depot while it is in Santa Barbara. And again, remember, I mentioned that sometimes these depots move around. So this depot or this photo is actually credited and attributed as saying that it's in Ventura. And I can tell you folks, I can see the depot clearly in the right-hand edge of the photo. Let's take a little closer look at that. There it is. And I was able to match it up to the Sanborn map. So I was very excited to find this depot photo, even though it wasn't in the Santa Barbara collection, it's in the Ventura County Museum collection. So to prove my point, here's a blueprint of the Santa Barbara Chapala Street Depot. Now you're probably reading the screen and saying, okay, well, Jean-Guy, it says Irwindale Depot on there. That's what it says on the blueprint. Well, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, it says this portion to be removed here from Chapala Street, Santa Barbara. So here's an instance where the Southern Pacific picked up this depot, disassembled it, and reused it in another location. Now, this particular depot was a baggage, kind of like a baggage depot. So it was like a small passenger station. It had a very small office and an open waiting passenger shed. Here's another view of the blueprint. And then also a backside view of the depot, again, after it's moved to Irwindale. Now here's a front view. So again, this is what you would have seen if you were standing on the corner of Chapala and Gutierrez in Santa Barbara back in the 1890s. But again, this particular little waiting station was moved to Irwindale. And apparently it survived up until 1940. If you look off again to the left, you can see a Southern Pacific outhouse over there in the back. And then in the background on the right, you actually see the freight section of a it's like a freight house that was built also at Irwindale. Here's my blueprint of that charming little Chapala Street depot. Again, a great little, it's relatively unknown in Santa Barbara. All the history books always show, the Mission style depot and the Salem style depot, but they very rarely show this. I've never seen this one until I found it during my research. One of the more unique structures that the Southern Pacific was involved with was the wharf spur that was added on to Stearns Wharf in 1888. You can see the spur just starting construction and progressing from the beach out towards the end of the wharf. And it was completed by 1888, so within a year of the railroad's arrival to Santa Barbara, which showed the importance of Stearns Wharf and the importance of the railroad. They used to just take the lumber and dump it off the ships, and then it would float up to the beach. When the wharf was built, then they could offload it from there onto the wharf, and then they would have to use carriages to take it, onto land. But then once the railroads came into town, they used flat cars to bring the lumber to the lumber yards. And then here's a view of it in the 1910s. The spur was used for only 10 years, and it was discontinued in around 1898. But it remained for a few years after that. But by the 1920s, you can see that the spur was actually removed, and there was just a little stub of it left. And for those that are longtime Santa Barbarans, you might remember in the late 80s and early 90s with the old Sea Center, there was actually a little flat car that had lumber and like old wooden barrels on it, and a little piece of track that was on the end of this little stub as a memento or a memorial to the old railroad spur. I'm very sad that the city took that off there when they renovated the Sea Center. So if you're out there in the city and maybe you can bring it back. I would love to see that. One of the other early depots that was built in Santa Barbara, again, this was built around 1901 when the Southern Pacific was realigning their tracks. This was the freight house. Now, this is different than the other depots we've looked at because this one is solely dedicated for freight. It was a very large building. Once the railroad was realigned, the other Mason Street depot, the number 16 depot, was dismantled around 1906, and parts of it were reused to rebuild a depot that was in San Fernando, California, also a number 16 that suffered a fire. So again, here we see an example of the Southern Pacific recycling a depot and using it in another station. I always thought that maybe that this was the old number 16 depot reused here in Santa Barbara, but that was not the case. This was actually a new freight house that was built when the tracks were being redone. This building lasted until January 1970, and you can see here the building is undergoing demolition. So this depot is no longer with us. Next, we're coming to one of my favorite depots, of course, the Mission Style Depot that's in downtown Santa Barbara. The location of this particular depot was determined by the Potter Hotel, which had opened in 1903. The railroad was starting to realign their tracks around 1904. And so they purchased the land for where the depot is now in that year. And they announced that they were going to build this a new depot in the old Spanish style. The architect was Francis Wilson. Here are a look at the proposed blueprints for the Santa Barbara depot. I just love the quality of the drafting in these blueprints. It's just a lot of fun. This was an all concrete depot. The cost was actually a staggering $20,000, or if you convert that today, it's roughly about, I think it was $600,000 today for construction costs, which still even seems kind of low. But it was appointed with great works of art. A San Francisco artist by the name of George Marion Cummings created those wonderful plaster relief sculptures of Junipero Serra and the Vaquero, which is located on the depot fireplace mantles. They used marble in all the thresholds, and it's a fantastic building. It's got these beautiful inlaid ceramic tile floors, and it was adjacent to the Potter Hotel. So they actually had this walkway that connected directly from the depot to the Potter Hotel. And they had this wonderful little stone gate with the Potter sign there. Here's a look at the depot a couple of years, about, relatively close to after it opened. It opened on January 1st, 1906, although construction was completed by the end of 1905. Here's some more views of this all concrete depot. One of the things that I like, and if you look at the photograph that's in the bottom left-hand corner, if you look in closely, you'll see a little railroad bell that's up on that parapet right next to the concrete finial. And they would use that to signal when the trains were about to leave, so that people could come back to the train. Now, one of the things as a depot historian that I absolutely love is interior photographs of depots. They are extremely rare. Most photographs of train stations, where do you think the people take them? From the track side. They want to see the action of the passengers and the trains. So a lot of these depot photographs that we see are taken from the front of the building. Very rarely do you see the backside of the depots, and even rarer still, and really, gems, are interior photographs of the depots. Now, as a depot historian, I recognized where this depot photograph was taken. It's in a popular book on railroad history by a gentleman of the name of Lucius Beebe, and he identified it as the Fresno Depot. When I looked at this picture, I'm like, that's not Fresno, because if I look through that ticket window there on the right, there's the relief sculpture by Cummings of the Vaquero. So you can see it right through the window. So this is indeed a previously unknown photograph of the interior of the agent's office in Santa Barbara. And in fact, when you line up all the walls and where the ticket windows were with the blueprints, it matches it exactly. So this is a rare treat to see an interior photograph of the depot. But wait, there's more. About 2 weeks ago on eBay, which is a nice little source for depot photographs, I actually saw a couple of these interior photos of the baggage room come up on eBay. So I was ecstatic, and here they are, sharing with you. And people traveled light in those days. They didn't really pack a lot of luggage or things like that, obviously. Here's another view of the baggage room and some of the station personnel that worked there, the baggage men, the station agents, ticket agents. It's a wonderful, collection of photographs. If someone's out there and you search on eBay, you'll see these, and I would highly recommend it if you can afford it. Here's another great grouping of gentlemen from that same photo collection posed at the open baggage shelter end of the depot. I love that. Santa Barbara's weather is so nice. You can actually store your baggage outside in the open in this open baggage shelter. And passengers can enjoy that same benefit. Here's a view of the open passenger shelter in 1915. And I am very pleased to say that when the depot underwent its restoration, it was actually very well done, and it looks almost identical to the postcard. Here's a view of it in 2020. Here's another view of the depot in the 1920s. The depot, of course, being close to the Potter Hotel, was witness to its destruction on April 13th, 1921. You can just barely see the edge of the roof of the depot off to the left, and you can see a standard Southern Pacific light post there. And there's the tracks of the platform right there. And then, of course, another disaster struck. This was the earthquake of June 29th, 1925. The depot itself, surprisingly, being all concrete, did suffer a little bit of damage. And I was surprised because I thought that people would have photographed the depot to document such damage, but I've never seen any photographs of it. However, the Southern Pacific did commission an earthquake strengthening of the depot after the earthquake. So there was some minor damage to the building, but they wanted to make the building safer. So these are the actual drawings that the Southern Pacific did to seismically reinforce the depot. So it shows the brackets and angle irons that they used to strengthen the building. Of course, you know, who could mention Santa Barbara without Fiesta? So again, this is a great photo from the Edson Smith collection of the Santa Barbara Public Library. People gathered for Fiesta at the depot. The Southern Pacific was very big on promoting the towns that they served, so they would come up with these promotional posters. So, and then of course there's some flower girls welcoming the daylight into Santa Barbara. World War II, the depot was very busy. It was kind of fun to find this colored slide on eBay. So it's kind of neat to see our men and women of the armed services there at the depot. The depot underwent some changes after World War II. The open waiting area that was filled in by the railroad as offices. And so in 1971, you can just see those being filled in there when Amtrak took over passenger service nationwide. So here's a photo of the hastily erected Amtrak logo at the Santa Barbara Depot. But what's really nice is that the Santa Barbara Depot has been fully restored. It underwent a grand restoration in 1999. They fixed a lot of the tile floors. They, cleaned up the wood. They restained it, repainted it. They restuccoed it back based on studying the original plaster textures. They restored a lot of the original fixtures. They removed the offices that were added after World War II and restored the open waiting room. So it's really a treasure to visit this depot. And another fact is that it actually has a lot of its original furnishings, a lot of this mission style furnishings. So it's really a treat to visit it. And our depot was added to the National Register of Historic Places back in 2006. So it's a nice honor for this surviving grand dam of Santa Barbara, Southern Pacific architecture. And again, if you get the chance and you're downtown, take a tour through the building. It's really, really beautiful. Now let's look at the blueprint. Again, this was a passenger depot. It was, it didn't handle freight. So the baggage room is off there to the left, large office. The second floor also contained offices for the railroad. They weren't living quarters for the agent in this instance. A large central waiting room, and then a separate ladies' retiring room and ladies' restroom for them as well. And then a separate men's restroom off of the main waiting room. And then the agents themselves had their own little private restroom. And then, of course, there were stairs that went up to the second floor. But there's skylights that illuminate the interior spaces of the two waiting rooms. So it's really a nice, beautiful depot. The next railroad building we're going to look at is the Railway Express building that was built in 1906. It's off here to the left. And you might remember it as the open air bicycle shop, or as recently as 2012, it's been home to Greyhound. It's really neat to see these early photographs of the building because it's actually undergone some changes. As you can see, as the photos progress, this is actually taken, this photo is taken from the Potter Hotel, looking down upon the depot just after it was completed. You can see the Potter Hotel's tennis courts there in the foreground and the Railway Express building off to the left. Here's another community celebration going on at the railroad depot. And you can just see the Railway Express building off to the left. Again, I'm always looking at all the photos because you can never tell when it's going to capture even a part of a building. And you can see that the Railway Express building actually had a little parapet on the front wall. When you look at modern photos that we're going to see in a moment, that parapet was removed. So it's no longer there. So photos like this are extremely valuable in that they capture this building's change over time. Here is what I'm talking about. So by 1953, that parapet wall at the front of the Railway Express Agency is gone, and the roof has been shed all the way down. So, you know, it dramatically changed the appearance of the building. Here's another view of it from 1968. You can see the depot in the background and the Railway Express building off to the left. And what's also great is it captures one of those private rail spurs that we're going to look at a little bit later. Here's a close-up of the Railway Express building in 2012 when Amtrak moved in after open-air bicycles, which had been there for many years, had moved out. But I love the architecture of this building because it's very complementary to the Santa Barbara Depot. There's a lot of similar details. Same, you know, with the window transoms, the woodwork. Again, it's a really charming little building. And here it is now in 2021. And actually, the city of Santa Barbara owns both this and the depot. And Greyhound has a small portion of the building as their depot. But the rest of the building is actually available for rent. Next, we're going to look at another little charming building that the Southern Pacific built. This is the Car and Signalman's building, built in 1909. And we're very lucky that this little building still exists today. It's directly across from the depot. When you look at the floor plan, it says that there's a carman's room, a signalman's room, and then a fuel bunker that has coal bins and a wood bin. Here's a look at that little signalman's building in 1968. A little worse for the wear and tagged by a graffiti artist. And again, in 1980, needing some much needed love. But what was nice was that in 1999, when the depot underwent its restoration, the little signalman's building was also restored. So it's quite a little charming building. Not actively used, but preserved on the exterior. So at least it's safe. Now we're going to look at those private rail spurs that I mentioned. When you look at this photograph, look at between the locomotive and the depot, right there in the middle. Let's zoom in on that. You can see two private rail cars right there at the end of the depot. Wealthy Easterners, when they visited Santa Barbara, would park their rail cars at the depot while they were in residence, and they needed a place to park their cars. Here's an aerial view from 2020, and you can just see the outlines of the private rail spurs. Again, during the restoration of the depot, these were actually etched into the concrete, so to show where these two private rail spurs were. I think it's a wonderful restoration detail. And my friend Alex Cole had told me that they had requested that this be part of the restoration, fellow historian. Here's a look at the private rail car, the Santa Barbara business car 142, that's parked permanently at the depot. So I actually had the fortune to go through that car when it was undergoing restoration, but I won't bore you with pictures of the inside. Contact me and I can share some of those photos. So speaking of private spurs, there was a private car shed that I found was built in or proposed for Santa Barbara for Max C. Fleischman, who was arrived in Santa Barbara in 1911 and had his private rail car here. He would visit Santa Barbara often and eventually moved here after World War I ended in the 1920s. These private car sheds were actually nothing more than a wood shelter that shaded the cars so they wouldn't get too hot and protected them from the elements. So it's kind of interesting to find out that actually this particular car shed was proposed for Santa Barbara. Now I should mention that some of these blueprints are courtesy of the Southern California Railroad Museum and my friend archivist Terry Salmons. It's a wonderful collection that we have here in Southern California of previously unknown depot blueprints and drawings. And it's an amazing resource. And so a lot of you here tonight are actually seeing these for the very first time since they were drafted, which makes them real gems. Finally, we're starting to look at some of the other rail facilities in Santa Barbara. This is the Santa Barbara Railyard in 1927. You can just see the Cabrillo Pavilion that had just been completed up there in the upper right-hand part of the photograph. And you can see Cabrillo Boulevard there running along the beach. In the middle of the photograph, you see the beautiful Santa Barbara Roundhouse. You can see a water tower, oil tank, and other facilities, including a turntable. Let's take a look at it from the other direction. So again, there's another view of the Roundhouse and all the associated rail facilities. And in the distance, you can just make out the Santa Barbara Freight House. So the Southern Pacific built a powerhouse and machine shop. These blueprints were dated 1910, so that supported the rail yards. And they also built a sand house circa 1907. And I actually have a little photograph of the sand house. There it is in the rail yards, a little close-up of it. We also had a little small scale house so that freight cars could be weighed. And of course, our beautiful roundhouse. So we had a standard brick roundhouse up until June 29th, 1925, when we had our earthquake. So the roundhouse did not fare very well. And there was, of course, a rush to rebuild it. But the community asked that the depot be rebuilt in a Spanish style. So they looked to the bull ring in Seville, Spain, and we got a brand new, well, a refurbished roundhouse. So the Southern Pacific went over and drafted up plans for rehabilitating the old brick roundhouse. And this is what they came up with. And here's a look at our brand new Spanish bull ring roundhouse, circa 1926, just after it was completed. You can see the little flag poles going up along the roof there. I don't know if they ever flew flags on it. I've never seen pictures of that, but at least the flag poles were there. So it was still a brick and concrete building, reinforced, and then it was finished in plaster. So there's a look at the one end of the roundhouse. And a frontal view, you can see the turntable in the foreground there. And then in the later years, it was used after the railroad was finished with it. They used it as a lumber yard. The turntable, of course, was removed. Here's a backside of the Roundhouse from 1969. The Roundhouse, of course, is no longer with us today because of this gentleman, Mr. Fess Parker. He actually redeveloped all of the railroad yards, and it became the Red Lion Resort. So there he is with his proposed design for the resort. And this is the site of the old Roundhouse in where they built kind of like a rotunda structure to mimic or reminisce of the old Roundhouse in Santa Barbara. And there's a little historical plaque there that talks about it. So we're almost at the end of our track. We're now going to venture into Goleta and look at its depots. It actually had two of them. When the railroad came to Goleta in 1887, it actually had a number 14 one-story combination depot. And I was really excited because I had found this track plan that showed the depot built in Goleta, which confirmed that it actually had the station there. But I had never seen a photograph until the Edson Smith collection. And my friend Lisa Lunsford and John Woodward, who were digitizing these wonderful photographs of Santa Barbara for the public library. They sent me this photograph and I said, oh my God, do you know what you have there? That's the Goleta Depot. And they're like, really? And I'm like, yes, you can see it in the background. You can see the depot with the freight cars. So ignore the kid with the pumpkins and you look beyond him. And there's a close-up of the only known photograph of Goleta's first train depot from 1887 to 1901. So again, remember the Southern Pacific was straightening out their tracks, trying to eliminate these curves. So in 1901, they relocated the unused Goleta Depot to Sunnyvale, California. And here's a picture of Goleta's first depot in service at Sunnyvale, California. I believe this particular depot had the distinction of being the furthest moved depot, something like over 300 miles from where it originally was constructed and built. So quite a far distance for a depot. Here's the backside of the Sunnyvale depot, just to give you an idea of what the original depot would have, what it looked like. It survived up until the 1950s, and then it met a tragic fate with a tornado, of all things. A severe windstorm actually blew that depot down, and it was replaced by another depot. Here's a look at Goleta's depot and the blueprint. And then here is just a moment. So here's a look at the Goleta train depot that replaced it in 1901. So this was a two-story combination number 22 depot along the railroad's new alignment through Goleta. This particular depot did have living quarters for the agent and his family. So that's what the second story was for. Here's a look at the backside of the depot. This depot had a pretty good service life. It lasted up until 1973 when it was closed in October. And here's a picture of it after it was closed and just before it was relocated to Stowe Park in 1981. So as you can see, the depot had a little bit of a rough time there in between when it was closed. But a lot of people see depots like this and they think they can't be saved or salvaged and they're beyond hope. Well, I can tell you in this next slide, that's pure poppycock, because here is a wonderfully restored 1901 depot that's now on the National Register of Historic Places. When you compare it to that photograph in 1981 and you see the amazing job that Gary Coombs and Phyllis Olson and the other people of the Goleta committee that restored this depot did, it's amazing. So, And I highly encourage you to go out to the South Coast Railroad Museum. I was a volunteer there for over a decade. I used to run the little miniature train that went around the depot, and I would, give tours of the depot and, be in the gift shop and everything. And I'm very honored that the depot has my blueprint of it up in the gift shop and stuff. So I've had a long, loving relationship with the staff and volunteers at the South Coast Railroad Museum. And, this depot is great, for families because you can go and see a little HO scale train layout in the freight room, and you can tour the, the waiting room and the office. And I believe one day a year on Depot Day, you can actually go up into the agent's living quarters and actually see and experience what it was like to live in one of these rural train stations. It's really a unique building. Here's my blueprint of the number 22 depot. Again, standard floor plan, waiting room, office, baggage room, freight room, and then you had your bedrooms upstairs, a living room and a kitchen. Our last depot that we're going to look at tonight is in the community of Elwood, California. And it was built on the ranch of Elwood Cooper. That's 2 L's. But the Southern Pacific, I guess, apparently didn't know how to spell, and they dropped an L. So it became Elwood with 1 L. The depot was built originally in 1887, again, along their kind of windy alignment. But in 1901, the depot was actually realigned along the new tracks, it was actually picked up and rotated. So it was relatively in the same location. This depot sadly did not last beyond the 1930s, and it was demolished in July 1936. Here's a blueprint of the Southern Pacific Depot in Elwood that I drew. So as we're kind of wrapping up this lecture, I thought it would be kind of neat to kind of show what the future for Goleta's Depot is. As some of you may know on this presentation, there's a new depot that's proposed for the city of Goleta. So what I thought was very fascinating is that we look to the past of these railroad depots in developing new train stations. There's a certain kind of an affinity for the old, an appreciation of the vintage architecture, the classic nature of these buildings, the timelessness of these designs. And so I've been watching the progress of the development of the proposed train station for Goleta. At one point, they actually considered relocating the old 1901 depot and reusing it as an active train station. But that wasn't feasible. And so they're, of course, proposing a new depot, but in a traditional style. There were 2 other depot types that were more modern. They weren't as favored. The traditional won out at 50%. The other 2 were tied at like 25%. So I thought it was very nice that the firm of Anil Verma, which designs a lot of these transportation centers, was looking at the architectural heritage of these old wooden train stations. And so this is their proposed, this is one of the early designs for the traditional train station type. And here's a few more renderings of it from their public presentations. And this is their current scheme, which is rather interesting. It's a lot more modern than the traditional designs that they had previously proposed. So, maybe things will swing back full circle back to a more kind of traditional looking train station. So with that, I want to thank you for taking this fantastic journey with me through Southern Santa Barbara County, looking at some of the unique train stations that we had here on the South Coast. And again, I want to thank my hosts, the Santa Barbara Historical Museum, the Goleta Valley Historical Society, and the South Coast Railroad Museum for graciously hosting this adventure for all of us. And again, just a couple of acknowledgments and thank yous to people that helped make my presentation and have helped me over the years. And just, again, you know, I love sharing my passion about these buildings and unique architecture with you. And as a little note, this lecture is dedicated in the memory of Thomas G. Smith. He was an architect in Santa Barbara that sadly passed away the other week. So he was a good friend of mine. He was a fellow railroad enthusiast. And I'm sure he's looking up there down on me and saying, you know, good job, Jean-Guy, you know, show those railroad depots. So again, I want to thank you. I encourage you to email me, and if you have any depot stories, if your family lived in a depot, if you have photographs in a photo album tucked away somewhere, you know, I love to hear from you. And if you're really interested in the blueprints that I draw, they are available in my book, Railroad Depots, Southern Pacific Collection. Shameless plug right there. It's available on Etsy. You can also find it on eBay. If you're also interested in knowing a lot about railroad depots, my good friend Henry Bender wrote a fantastic book on Southern Pacific Standard Design depots. And if you look inside his book, hey, Wayne, what do you know? It's one of my blueprints there as the end papers. And several of my blueprints are in his book too. So with that, I would like to open it up to questions.